Mississippi, 1934. A land where nightfall carried more than darkness. It carried warnings. It carried footsteps you prayed were only the wind. It carried the quiet, poisonous breath of men who hid their faces not out of shame, but out of pride. In this world walked James Carter, a soft-spoken carpenter with hands shaped by labor and a heart loyal to faith. When a white acquaintance, Thomas Brigg, a farmer whose smile was always too wide, invited James to supper at his home, the Tessicourt offer seemed strange but not impossible. Hard times made unlikely bridges. Hunger softened suspicion, and in that era, refusing a white man's hospitality could be taken as an offense with deadly consequences. James told his wife not to worry. "It's just supper," he said, lacing his work boots as twilight crept across the delta. But even he felt a tremor of unease beneath his ribs, a whisper carried from ancestors who knew danger long before they could name it. The path to Brigg's house stretched through fields still wet from the evening rain, the horizon bruised by a rising storm. Yet James walked on, unaware that every step he took was leading him deeper into a story older than the soil itself, a story of masks, betrayal, and a trap woven beneath the thin cloth of hospitality. The sun had barely set when James reached the narrow road leading to the Brigg farm. The light behind him dimmed into a dusky blue, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and pine. He wiped his brow, feeling the humidity cling to his skin like a warning. The crickets sang in the tall grass, but beneath their chorus was an unsettling quiet, a stillness that did not belong to evening. James paused a moment, listening, sensing, trying to place the strange weight that hung in the air. Ahead, the farmhouse sat on a small rise, its windows glowing a soft amber, warm, inviting, almost too inviting. Smoke curled from the chimney in deliberate, elegant swirls, as if someone had tended the fire with careful hands. James had known Thomas Brigg for years, a man of few words and many looks, each of them sharp enough to slice a man in two. But Thomas had never shown James hatred, only that stiff, distant politeness white men often wore when they didn't yet know if you were a threat. As James reached the steps, the wood creaked under his weight, an old house's moan echoing into the night. The door opened before he could knock. Thomas stood there, smiling in a way that didn't touch his eyes. "Evening, James," he said, voice calm as a stagnant river. "Come on in. Supper's almost ready." Behind him, the house glowed like a lantern in the dark, a beacon, a promise, or a lure. James stepped inside, unaware that the walls around him had been waiting. The warmth inside Thomas Brigg's house felt unnatural, as if the air itself had been forced into a shape it did not want to hold. James stepped further into the room, and the wooden floor creaked beneath his boots with a sound too sharp for such a small space. The table was set with a precision that made his stomach clench. Cloth pressed flat, plates gleaming, knives aligned like soldiers awaiting an unspoken command. The lamplight flickered uneasily, throwing shadows across the walls that moved in nervous shivers, as though the house were bracing for something it could not name. James lowered himself into the chair Thomas offered, but the seat felt rigid, unwelcoming, carved. From a silence that pushed back against him, he heard it again, that odd, heavy quiet that clung to the house like smoke. Houses usually breathed, the wind against the shutters, the settling of old beams, the quiet hum of night drifting through cracked windows. But this one felt sealed, closed up tight, suffocated by its own stillness. It was a quiet that seemed not to be the absence of sound, but the presence of listening. Thomas returned from the kitchen carrying a platter covered with a cloth that trembled slightly in his hands, not from heat, James realized, but from nerves. "Good meal tonight," Thomas said, but the cheer in his voice felt strained, stretched like fabric pulled too tight. He placed the dish on the table and wiped his palms on his trousers, eyes darting not toward James, but toward the back hallway, where the shadows pooled like dark water. James followed his gaze instinctively and felt the hair rise along his arms. There were boots near the door, more than Thomas could ever wear alone. Heavy boots, broad soles, mud-stiffened leather, the kind of footwear belonging to men who worked the earth by day and prowled it by night, men who rode under different rules and gathered under different lights. Their presence, even in absence, pressed into the wooden floorboards like fingerprints left on soft clay. Thomas noticed James looking and hurried to pull out a chair across from him, his hand shaking as he gestured. "Sit, sit, don't mind the mess. Been a long week, but the boots lined up too neatly for someone careless. Too quietly for someone sloppy, too deliberately for someone telling the truth." James tried to swallow the unease tightening around his ribs, but it moved with him, shadowing each breath like a second heartbeat. He watched Thomas sit down, shoulders tense, posture straight as a fence post. The man's eyes flickered between the kitchen door and the front window, never settling for more than a second. James could feel the tension radiating off him, not the discomfort of hosting a guest, but the dread of anticipating an event he could no longer control. The quiet between them was thick enough to slow time itself. Even the lamplight seemed to dim, as if retreating from the conversation that refused to begin. At last, James cleared his throat, his voice rough with the weight of something unseen. "You sure this is a good night for company, Thomas?" he asked, not accusingly, but with the calm caution of a man who'd learned to speak softly in dangerous rooms. Thomas's lips twitched, forming a smile that collapsed at its edges. "Best night I could think of," he replied, but the tremor behind the words betrayed him. And in that moment, James understood something vital. The danger was not coming. It was already here. The platter Thomas had brought to the table remained untouched, its cloth still draped over whatever lay beneath. James noticed the faint steam, rising from the edges, curling upward like soft, ghostly fingers that dissipated before reaching the lamplight. Thomas didn't lift the cover, didn't offer a prayer, didn't speak of the food at all, something no man from the Delta would forget during supper, especially not when offering a meal to a guest. Instead, he kept wetting his lips, shifting in his seat, glancing again and again toward the hallway as though the house itself held its breath. James leaned back slightly, sensing an invisible current tugging at the borders of the room. The walls felt too close, the air too thick, each moment stretching slender and taut like a wire ready to snap. He realized then that Thomas had not invited him for company, nor for friendship, nor for the faint cordiality that sometimes passed between black laborers and white farmers. He had invited him for a moment, one that had not yet arrived, but whose footsteps James could almost hear, pacing somewhere in the bones of the house. Thomas finally cleared his throat, the sound sharp in the muted room, and tried to muster a conversation that fell flat before it reached its first breath. He asked about work, about the weather, about the recent harvest. Topics so ordinary they felt artificial in a night that had already begun to crack at its edges. James answered politely, though his gaze examined every corner of the room as he spoke. The curtains over the windows were drawn tightly, stitched together at the edges as if someone wanted to ensure that not even a sliver of moonlight could slip inside. There was no breeze, no sound from outside, no chorus of crickets singing through the night. Only the steady ticking of the clock kept time with his heartbeat. Then James noticed something else. Scrape marks on the floor beneath the table, long and uneven, as though chairs had been dragged in haste or a heavy piece of furniture had been moved recently to make room. His pulse quickened. Thomas was watching him too closely now, studying his reactions the way a man might study a fuse burning toward dynamite. And yet he kept smiling, that thin, quivering smile that had begun to look less like hospitality and more like surrender to something he could no longer stop. The silence returned, deeper this time, settling between them like wet soil. James forced himself to breathe slowly, anchoring his instincts rather than letting them spiral into panic. His father once told him that a man could survive almost any storm if he learned to feel its direction before it broke. Tonight, the storm was inside the walls, gathering in the corners, gathering in Thomas's trembling hands, gathering in the unnatural stillness that pressed down on the house. James placed his palms on the table, steady and deliberate, and locked eyes with Thomas. "If there's something you need to say, you best say it plain," he murmured, voice low, firm, carrying the weight of a man who had weathered too many silences like this before. For a brief second, Thomas's facade collapsed. His eyes softened, his shoulders sagged, and fear, raw and human, broke through his mask. But just as quickly, he looked away and swallowed hard, as if swallowing the truth itself. That was when James knew Thomas was not the danger. Thomas was the warning. The air inside the house shifted the moment Thomas looked away, as though the space itself exhaled something it had been holding back. James felt it, an invisible ripple sliding along his spine, subtle but unmistakable, like the tremor in the ground before a train roars past. Somewhere deeper in the house, a floorboard groaned under a weight too steady to be the settling of old wood. It was not the soft, hesitant creak of a house adjusting to the night. It was the deliberate press of a boot heel. Thomas froze. His fork hovered midair, the muscles in his jaw tightening until his face seemed carved from stone. For a man who had invited another to supper, he looked remarkably like someone cornered in his own home. James lowered his gaze to his hands, feigning calm, but every sense burned awake. He could feel the thickness of the silence, swollen now with breath that did not belong to him or Thomas. Someone was back there, maybe more than one, listening, waiting, and the waiting was the part that chilled the deepest, because waiting meant timing. Timing meant purpose. Timing meant a plan already in motion. Thomas finally set his fork down, though it barely made a sound. His fingers trembled too much for it to land cleanly. His eyes flicked toward the hallway again, quick as a heartbeat, then darted to the front door as if measuring distance, 30 feet, maybe a little more. Nothing but a rug and a narrow table between them. He swallowed, Adam's apple jerking, the movement sharp enough to betray panic. "You sure you're comfortable, James?" he asked suddenly, voice cracking around the edges. The question sounded absurd in the suffocating quiet. A question meant not to soothe, but to stall. James recognized it instantly. His uncles used to say that a man's voice always betrays the moment he realizes he's walked too far into the dark without a lantern. And Thomas sounded like a man who hadn't just lost his lantern. He'd dropped it behind him, shattering it along the way. For the first time that night, James saw something flickering beneath the man's pale exterior. Shame. Not the sharp, defensive shame of anger, but the heavy, sluggish kind that dragged a man's conscience behind him like a chain. It was the look of someone who had made a choice before understanding the cost. James leaned back slowly, making no sudden movement, letting the room settle around him like dust falling through a beam of sun. If there were men hiding beyond that hallway, men who wore boots meant for riding through darkness, men whose hands smelled of kerosene and rope, then he needed to read Thomas before reading them. "I'm fine," James said softly, his tone even, steady as river stone. "But if there's something I ought to know, this is the time." His voice carried a quiet gravity, the kind born from years of speaking carefully to men who did not see him as equal, yet feared him all the same for reasons they would never name aloud. Thomas's eyes immediately filled, not with tears, but with a kind of desperate remorse. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again, fighting a war inside himself that he was already losing. His hand rose halfway across the table, as if he meant to warn James, to urge him to run, to take back the invitation he never should have offered. But before a single word escaped him, the floorboard in the hallway groaned again, this time closer. The second groan of the floorboard was different, closer, heavier, carrying the weight of someone who had stopped pretending to move quietly. It was the sound a man made when he no longer cared if he was heard. James felt the room tilt, not physically, but in the way danger rearranges everything it touches. The lamplight flickered again, shrinking before swelling back to life, as though even the flame sensed the presence approaching from the hall. Thomas's breath hitched, sharp and shallow, his shoulders collapsing inward as if a rope had just tightened around his chest. Whatever courage he'd been clinging to slipped from his grasp. James watched as Thomas's eyes, pale, restless, pleading, shifted from the hallway to him, then to the back door, then back again. It was the frantic tracking of a man who knew he had led someone into a cage he could no longer unlock. "James," Thomas whispered, voice barely audible. "I didn't," but the words died, strangled by fear, before they reached the air. His hand trembled toward James again, but the movement was too small, too late, too swallowed by everything closing in. A shadow appeared at the end of the hall, not fully formed, not yet a man, just the outline of a presence, broad shoulders, a hat brim, the hint of heavy fabric shifting softly with breath. James's blood turned cold, but he did not flinch, did not turn his face away. His father had taught him long ago that fear could smell its way through a room faster than a wolf tracking a wounded deer. Stillness was its own kind of armor, and so James remained still, elbows planted lightly on the table, palms relaxed, breath even. The sheer figure did not move, only stood there, letting the silence between them stretch thin as a razor's edge. Then came a second shadow beside the first, shorter but no less menacing, and the faint clink of metal brushing against metal. Rope buckle, spurs, a buckle on a belt. James couldn't be sure, but the sound carried a memory he wished he had never learned, the sound of men preparing themselves, not for conversation, but for harm. He could feel the temperature drop in the room, the air turning colder than the warm lamplight could explain. It was the cold of intention. Thomas finally broke, his voice trembling like a candle in wind. "I told them you'd come," he breathed, the confession slipping out of him like water through open hands. His face crumpled, years of guilt and cowardice carving lines across his skin. "They said it wouldn't go far. They said they only wanted to scare you, make an example. I didn't want this, James. I swear I didn't." But his words scattered uselessly on the table between them. James didn't raise his voice, didn't lash out, didn't even blink. "And yet," he murmured, calm as a man standing before judgment, "here we are." The hallway shadows swelled, merging as footsteps pressed forward, measured, confident, merciless in their rhythm. James inhaled slowly, anchoring himself to the moment, to the chair, to the steady beat of his heart. Whatever was coming had already begun tightening its grip long before he stepped onto Thomas's porch, but he would meet it with the fullness of who he was, a man shaped by faith, hard work, and the unbroken will of generations who refused to disappear quietly into the night. The footsteps from the hallway grew clearer, slow, deliberate, with the unhurried certainty of men who believed the night already belonged to them. Each step seemed to press against the wooden bones of the house, vibrating through the floor and into James's spine like the thrum of a distant drum. Thomas's breath came in sharp, panicked bursts, but James's remained steady, anchored by something deeper than fear. He had known danger before, felt it in the thick heat of summer nights, in the stares that lingered too long at the general store, in the whispered warnings passed quietly between neighbors. But this danger felt different. It had shape, intention. It moved with the confidence of those who knew that darkness was an ally, not an obstacle. James watched the shadows expand. Across the doorway, stretching toward the dining room like hands reaching ahead of their owners. He kept his posture calm, resisting the urge to rise or retreat, because movement was what predators watched for. Stillness, his father taught him, made the hunter hesitate. Fear made him move. Thomas stood abruptly, knocking his chair backward with a sharp clatter that cut through the silence like a gunshot. His hands shook so violently he had to grip the edge of the table to steady himself. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," he muttered, voice cracking under the weight of the lie he had carried for days. "They said they'd just talk to you, said you'd leave understanding your place." The last word hung in the air like smoke, thick and shameful. Thomas swallowed hard, eyes glistening with the kind of regret that comes too late to save anyone. "I tried to stop 'em," he whispered, though even he didn't sound convinced by his own claim. "Tried to say it. Wasn't right." James held his gaze, and for the first time, Thomas truly looked at the man he had invited into the trap. Saw not a worker, not a Negro he could call on for help around the farm, but a human being staring back at him with unwavering clarity. That truth struck Thomas deeper than any fist could. His face buckled, and he stumbled back a step, as if the weight of his choices had finally found a place to rest. The figures from the hall stepped forward at last, emerging enough for their outlines to take form. Their faces were still hidden, but James recognized the build of men who worked the land by day and spent their nights nurturing hatred like a harvest of its stone. One of them dragged something along the floor, a long, dull scrape that made the lamp flame tremble. A chair? A crate? The thought tightened James's chest, but he refused to give the sound power over him. He placed both palms flat on the table, grounding himself in the feel of the wood beneath. His fingertips. The house seemed to sigh under the tension, the walls holding secrets they had not asked to witness. "If you want to help me, Thomas," James said quietly, "you speak up now, because once they walk through that door, silence won't save you." The words struck the room with the force of truth. Thomas trembled, torn between the fear pressing from the hallway and the guilt crushing him from within. The shadows loomed closer, filling the doorway, and James knew the moment of revelation, whatever shape it would take, was seconds away. The first man stepped fully into the dining room doorway, and the air shifted with him, thickening, tightening, as though the room shrank around his presence. His face was hidden beneath a low hat brim, but the rest of him was unmistakable. Heavy coat, work-worn hands, boots crusted with the mud of long rural roads. Behind him, two more figures lingered at the threshold, like wolves biding their moment to advance. None spoke. None needed to. Their silence carried the same weight as a spoken sentence, one that promised humiliation at best and ruin at worst. James kept his breath slow, steady, watching the man's shoulders rise and fall in a rhythm too calm for the violence he carried. The lamplight caught on something at the man's waist, a glint of metal, small but sharp, maybe a belt buckle, maybe a tool, maybe something far worse hidden beneath his coat. The shadows behind the trio writhed like restless spirits, stretching toward James with long black fingers. The room seemed to pulse, every heartbeat echoing like a drumbeat announcing the inevitable. Thomas staggered backward, his voice cracking under the weight of panic. "You said you'd wait outside," he hissed, though not loud enough to sound like a real protest. His words were drenched in fear, trembling in the air like leaves caught in a storm. One of the men slowly turned his head toward Thomas, and even without seeing his eyes, the message was chillingly clear. Thomas had no authority, no power, no voice here. He was no more than a pawn, a trembling intermediary who had already fulfilled his usefulness. The man's posture said it all. Thomas's fate hung on the same thin thread as James's, though they stood on opposite sides of the night. "Don't talk," the tallest man finally muttered, his voice a deep, low rasp. "Not another word." The command seemed to steal the last of Thomas's strength. His shoulders slumped as he pressed himself against the wall, unable to meet James's eyes, unable to bear the reflection of the cowardice he had chosen. The smell of sweat, fear, and damp wool filled the room, clinging like fog. It was the scent of men who had come to enact a ritual older than the boards under their feet, a ritual of control, of terror, of reminding a black man that even breathing could be interpreted as trespass. James shifted slightly in his chair, not out of fear, but out of necessity, grounding himself, centering his balance, silently preparing without giving them the satisfaction of visible dread. His mind sharpened, clearing away everything but the present moment, the way a man might steady his hands before guiding a blade through stubborn wood. He understood now why the house had felt wrong the moment he entered. This wasn't a dinner, it wasn't a meeting, it wasn't even a threat disguised as hospitality. It was theater, carefully staged, painfully rehearsed, every detail designed to trap him in place until the players arrived. But in their arrogance, the men underestimated something vital. James Carter was not a man who panicked. He had been raised on stories of ancestors who survived nights far darker than this, who lived through storms meant to wash them from the earth. As the men stepped farther into the room, forming a half-circle around him, James felt an unexpected calm settle over him, heavy, resolute, unyielding. If this night intended to swallow him whole, it would find he was not so easily consumed. The tallest man took another step into the room, and the floorboards groaned beneath his weight. A long, low sound like the house itself was trembling. The lamplight stretched across his coat, revealing folds of heavy fabric still damp from the night air. He removed his hat slowly, almost ceremonially, as though announcing the true beginning of whatever this gathering was meant to be. His hair was cropped, short silver glinting at the temples, his expression carved into a hard, unmoving mask. He looked at James the way a man might study a stray animal that wandered too close to the edge of a property he believed belonged solely to him. "Evening, Carter," he said at last, his voice rough as gravel. It wasn't a greeting, it was a judgment, weighed and declared long before James had taken his first breath. The other two men shifted their stance, boots settling into firm positions, shoulders squared as if bracing for something that had not yet been spoken. The air tightened again, the kind of pressure that fills a room before a storm breaks, silent, electric, inevitable. Thomas pressed himself deeper into the wall, his face chalk white, breath coming in hurried gulps as though he'd been running for miles. The man who seemed to lead the group didn't look at him. Thomas's existence was no longer relevant to the unfolding script. Instead, the leader focused fully on James, examining him not with curiosity, but with certainty, as though he'd been rehearsing this moment for weeks. "You been walking round this county like you forgot how things work," he said calmly, almost conversationally. "Talking bold, looking folks in the eye, making decisions for yourself." His tone sharpened on the last phrase, slicing the air with an accusation that implied far more than the words themselves carried. James did not respond. He simply held the man's gaze, unwavering, and that refusal to bow his eyes, something so small, so human, made one of the men behind the leader shift angrily, as if the sight alone had offended him beyond reason. The tension surged, humming through the room like a taut wire ready to snap. The leader placed both hands on the table, leaning forward just enough for the shadows to carve lines across his face. "We don't come here tonight for trouble," he said, though the tone beneath the words suggested he believed. Trouble itself had come embodied in James. "We come because some things need settling, but only if you cooperate." The word hung between them like a rusted chain. Cooperation, in the mouths of men like these, never meant conversation or mutual understanding. It meant surrender, silence, shrinking until one barely existed at all. James recognized the tactic. Start soft, speak slow, cloak intention in civility, so that when cruelty arrived, it could claim it had been invited. He let the man's words wash over him without reaction, steady as bedrock beneath a rushing river. Inside, however, he felt a different current rising, quiet and powerful, the same current that had kept his grandparents standing long after the world tried to bow them. The men expected fear, trembling, pleading. Instead, they found a man who understood them far too well, and in that understanding, a spark began to form, small, steady, dangerous in a way none of them were prepared to face. The leader straightened slowly, pushing himself upright with a calm so rehearsed it felt like ritual. Behind him, the two other men shifted again, widening their stance just enough to signal that the room now belonged to them. James understood the choreography. He'd seen it in quiet fields, in backroom whispers, in the way certain white men moved when they believed their authority came from the soil itself. They arranged themselves not as individuals, but as a single force wearing three bodies. Thomas watched from the corner, trembling so violently his shoulder thudded softly against the wall. James felt the tremor of the house, the faint hum of tension seeping through the very boards, but he remained steady. He studied each man as though memorizing every line, their posture, their clothing, their clenched jaws. They were not here for a spontaneous act. They were here for something decided long before this night, long before the invitation to supper. Whatever words the leader spoke next would not be new. They would be a script passed down like an inheritance of cruelty. The leader took a slow breath, as if savoring the moment. "Folks been watching you," he said, tapping the table once with a thick finger. "Notin' how you carry yourself, how you talk, how you forget the order of things." He paused, letting the silence after his words stretch into something heavy. "County ain't big enough for men wandering round thinking they can do as they please." His voice was quiet, but it dragged authority behind it like a shadow. One of the men behind him let out a soft grunt of agreement, the kind meant to punctuate the leader's message without prompting. James didn't answer. He didn't even blink. His stillness seemed to unsettle them more than any argument would have. The leader's eyes narrowed as he leaned closer, as though trying to force a reaction out of him. "You best take heed," he murmured. "A man who walks too tall invites the wind to knock him over. The metaphor hung in the room like a threat wrapped in folklore, a warning disguised as wisdom. James exhaled slowly, allowing the breath to steady him, to center him, to remind him that the men before him were not forces of nature, no matter how much they believed themselves to be. They were flesh and fear, bones and ego, held together by a system that had taught them since birth that brutality was inheritance and dominance a birthright. He spoke at last, his voice calm but resonant, the kind of tone that carried weight precisely because it did not rise. "I walk the way God made me to walk," he said. "Not tall, not small, just honest." The simplicity of his words seemed to unsettle the leader more than defiance would have. The man's jaw flexed, a ripple of anger moving beneath his skin like a muscle memory. The other two men stiffened, shifting their weight as though bracing for something larger than the words themselves. And Thomas, poor Thomas, let out a strangled gasp, covering his mouth as if to keep his own fear from escaping into the room. In that moment, James understood something the men had not noticed yet. Fear could be contagious, yes, but so could courage. The leader's lips curled into something that was not quite a smile, more a tightening, a pulling back, as if his face resisted the very notion of amusement. James's calmness had unsettled him, slicing through the carefully prepared script these men had carried with them into the house. They expected trembling, pleading, maybe anger, but not composure. Composure disrupted the balance. Composure meant James saw them as men, not monsters, and men could be confronted. Monsters demanded worship. The leader shifted his stance, boots grinding softly against the wood, and the sound carried through the room with the weight of a warning. "Honest," he repeated, rolling the word in his mouth like it tasted wrong. "Honest don't mean equal." He stepped closer to the table, his shadow swallowing the space between them. This county was built on order, men who know their place and men who enforce it. His voice dropped lower, quieter but more dangerous for the softness. "You ain't the one who enforces it." Thomas squeezed his eyes shut at those words, as though hearing them declared aloud made everything real in a way he had tried desperately to deny. The other two men leaned in behind their leader, forming a silent wall of intent. One of them tugged at his coat sleeve, revealing the edge of a glove that looked too new to be for work, new enough to be for ceremony. The sight struck James with the cold clarity of dawn. These men had not stumbled into this house on impulse. They had dressed for this, prepared for this, expected this. The room felt smaller than ever now, the lamplight dimming beneath the weight of their presence. James felt his pulse steady, not rising, not faltering, simply grounding itself in the truth he had known since the moment he set foot in the house. Whatever these men wanted, it was not understanding, and whatever script they carried, he was not obliged to play his role. "You talk about order," James said quietly, his voice even and unbroken, "but order built on fear don't last. It only grows rot." The leader's nostrils flared just slightly, but enough to show the crack in his composure. "You don't know what you're saying," the man warned, though even he sounded unsure. "I know exactly what I'm saying," James replied, leaning forward just enough to reclaim the space the leader tried to steal. "And you hear it clear." The room seemed to shudder with that statement, as if the house itself recognized a shift in the balance. The leader stared at him for a long moment, jaw tight, hands curled slowly into fists at his sides, not from desire to strike, but from the frustration of losing control of the scene. This night was supposed to follow a script, but James, with nothing more than his breath and his steadiness, had begun rewriting it. Behind the leader, the two other men exchanged uneasy glances, and in the corner, Thomas choked on a sob he could no longer hold back. The leader finally tore his gaze from James, as though the steadiness in the other man's eyes seared him more deeply than any shouted defiance could. He paced a slow half-circle around the table, boots thudding softly against the floorboards in a rhythm that felt too measured to be indecision. It was calculation, each step a silent needle stitching the room tighter. When he stopped behind James's chair, the air thickened, heat rising from the lamp as though the flame itself leaned away from the tension. "Men like you," the leader said, voice drifting over James's shoulder. Forget themselves when nobody's around to remind them. His breath was warm, carrying the faint scent of tobacco and old bitterness. You work well, you keep quiet, you stay in your lane. Folks, let you live peaceful. A pause, soft, deliberate. But you start walking round looking like you got ideas bigger than the land you stand on. Well, the man exhaled, a slow hiss that brushed the back of James's neck. That's when reminders get necessary. Thomas let out a broken sound, somewhere between a gasp and a plea, but the leader didn't acknowledge him. The other two men edged closer, forming a loose semicircle that made the dining room feel like a pen, a fenced-in yard where something was about to be cornered. James kept his posture straight, refusing to give them the satisfaction of even a flinch. He felt the weight of the leader's presence behind him like a storm pressing down on the roof of a house, heavy, oppressive, waiting for the right moment to break. The leader tapped his gloved fingers against the back of James's chair, slow and rhythmic, as though marking the tempo of his own authority. "It ain't personal, Carter," he murmured. "This is how, and things stay steady, how we keep the peace round here." The hypocrisy was so blatant it almost felt surreal. Men who lived off fear always dressed their cruelty as order. Men who enforced terror always called it peace. James recognized the pattern. His grandfather had seen it. His great-grandmother had lived it. James slowly turned his head, not fast, not defiantly, but with a calm that felt carved from something older than the room, older than the men, older than the hatred pressing in. On him, the leader's hand froze, suspended above the chair as their eyes met again. James held that gaze with a quiet strength that made the man step back, not enough to seem afraid, but enough to reveal he had felt something shift. "Peace built on silence ain't peace," James said softly. "It's just quiet fear." The leader's jaw tensed, muscles twitching beneath his skin like a rope drawn too tight. For a moment it seemed he might lash out, not physically but verbally, violently, with the kind of words that struck deeper than fists. But something in James's stillness stopped him, something in the unbroken steadiness of a man sitting alone before three intruders unnerved him. Behind the leader, the other men shifted again, the first subtle signs of doubt creeping into the cracks of their bravado. And in the corner, Thomas slid down the wall to his knees, hands over his face, as if he had finally realized that the night he thought he could control had spiraled far beyond anything he understood. The leader's composure began to crack in small, telling ways, barely visible shifts in his stance, a shrinking of the space between his brows, a tightening at the corners of his mouth. Men like him were accustomed to commanding fear the way preachers commanded scripture, with confidence born from repetition. But James's calm refusal to bend, to avert his gaze, to shrink, this disrupted the old rhythm. It was as if James had stepped outside the script, and the leader suddenly found himself without lines. He circled back to the front of the table, planting both hands firmly on the edge, leaning forward until his shadow spilled over James like a curtain. "You think you're brave," he muttered, but the softness of his voice betrayed uncertainty. "You think you're something special, but courage is a quick thing, Carter. Burns fast, burns out." He said the words like he was trying to convince himself more than the man sitting across from him. The lamplight danced over his face, etching deeper lines that looked less like authority and more like desperation, wearing authority's mask. The other two men exchanged glances, a flicker of doubt, barely there, but undeniable to anyone who had learned to read danger through subtleties. Doubt was a dangerous thing among men who relied on collective will. It weakened the spine of the group, loosened the grip of the night they wielded like a weapon. One of them shifted his weight, boots, scraping the floor in a sound that startled even Thomas, who flinched, though no one spoke to him. The leader sensed the shift behind him and straightened, jaw locking as he attempted to regain control. "This ain't about you being scared," he snapped, more sharply now. "This is about you remembering what happens when folks forget who keeps things running in this county." His finger jabbed toward the floor, emphasizing a point he could feel slipping from his grasp. James didn't respond, not out of fear, but in a deliberate choice. Silence can be armor, silence can be a mirror, and in that moment, James's silence reflected back every insecurity the leader had tried to bury beneath threats and old rituals. The third man, broad-shouldered, younger than the others, finally stepped forward. He stared at James with an intensity sharpened not by conviction but by confusion. "He ain't scared," the man said quietly, voice barely above a whisper. The leader stiffened, as though the words themselves were an act of betrayal. "He should be," the leader growled, but the edge in his voice had dulled. The younger man shook his head once, subtle but clear. "I ain't never seen someone sit that still with 3 men standing over him." His words hung heavy in the dim room, thick with something unspoken, respect, curiosity, or a dawning awareness of the humanity they had tried to strip from the moment. Thomas looked up, eyes swollen, and for the first time he seemed to see the fracture creeping through the night, a fragile line splintering the ritual the men had come here to perform. James finally spoke, his voice steady as a church bell rung at dawn. "Fear don't lead me, never has." And the men felt it, felt the truth in his tone, felt the shift in the room, felt the unraveling of something they had counted on to hold steady. For the first time, the night belonged to someone other than them. The leader's face tightened at the younger man's words, a twitch of irritation cutting across his expression like a crack in old plaster. He wasn't accustomed to losing the room, especially not to a man who had come here tonight expecting to stand on the side of unquestioned authority. For a brief moment, the leader looked less like a figure of power and more like a man scrambling to hold onto a crumbling script. He straightened his shoulders, lifting his chin with stubborn pride, but the certainty behind his eyes had dimmed. "Sit. Still long enough," he muttered, "and even a fool can look fearless." But the insult didn't land. His voice lacked the brutal conviction required to make it sting. James could feel the imbalance shifting, subtle but unmistakable, like the first tilt of the earth before a landslide begins its quiet descent. The men who had entered the house, convinced of their dominance, were now questioning a truth they'd never allowed themselves to examine. That power borrowed from fear is weak. The moment fear refuses to cooperate. Thomas's breathing had slowed into painful little gasps, each one sounding like it fought its way through the guilt lodged in his throat. He crawled to his feet, fingers trembling as he braced himself against the wall. His voice, when it finally emerged, was brittle and small. "Enough," he whispered. No one turned toward him. It was as though he didn't exist in the shape of the moment, like a ghost tied to his own living body. "Enough," he repeated, louder this time, the word cracking as it left him. The younger man glanced toward him, brows furrowing slightly, but the leader didn't bother to look. "This ain't your place to speak," the leader barked, but again the command lacked its earlier force. Thomas pressed his palms to his face, shaking as a harsh sob tore free. "I didn't bring him here for this," he cried. I didn't know it had—" His confession tumbled apart, useless in the face of what the night had already become. Yet even his brokenness added to the shift. Weakness in one of their own was another fracture the leader couldn't afford. James looked up at Thomas then, really looked at him, and in the other man's eyes he saw something not unlike a drowning man realizing he is the one who led himself into deep water. James didn't speak. He didn't curse him or comfort him. His silence allowed the truth to hang unshielded in the room, and that truth weighed heavier on Thomas than any words could have. The younger man's gaze flicked between Thomas and James again, confusion deepening into something else. Unease, maybe even recognition. He saw 2 men caught in the machinery of an old cruelty, both suffocating under its grind, though in vastly different ways. When his eyes met James's, something passed between them, a flicker of understanding so faint it might have been imagination, but James felt it settle in his chest like a spark landing on dry kindling. The leader sensed it too. His jaw snapped shut as fury finally cracked through his veneer. "Enough talk!" he growled, fists clenching at his sides. But even as he said it, the moment had shifted beneath him. The order he clung to was unraveling, thread by thread, and in its place rose something he had not prepared for, a man who would not bend, and witnesses who could no longer pretend not to see. The leader's command hovered in the air like smoke, thick, choking, and desperate. But it did not settle the room the way he intended. Instead, it exposed the hollowness beneath his authority, a sound meant to tether the moment back under his control, but arriving too late to reclaim what had slipped through his fingers. James watched him carefully, noting the small tremors along the man's jawline, the faint pulse beating at his temple, the way his eyes darted, not toward James, but toward his own men, as if fearing he might lose them too. That fear, subtle yet unmistakable, breathed new life into the tension. The room, once locked in the power of the men's arrival, was now shifting, tilting its weight toward James, toward truth, toward the growing cracks in the ritual these men believed unbreakable. The house felt warmer suddenly, the air moving again, as if even the walls had decided they would no longer hold the night's silence in obedience, and James felt it too, a quiet stirring beneath his ribs, not triumph, not defiance, but clarity. The younger man stepped forward again, just slightly, but enough that the leader shot him a look sharp enough to slice through cloth. The young man didn't retreat. His features were conflicted, eyes narrowed with thought, lips pressed thin, as he watched James with a scrutiny that held no hatred, only confusion and something dangerously akin to respect. "He ain't acting like the others," the young man muttered under his breath, a thought that slipped free before he could catch it. The leader snapped, "The others don't matter. This one thinks he can set his own rules." He jabbed a finger in James's direction, but his hand shook, betraying a truth none dared say aloud. If control could be measured in steady hands, the leader had already lost his share. James leaned forward ever so slightly, not as challenge but as acknowledgement of the shifting ground. "You came here to teach me something," he said, voice level, strong. "But seems you're the ones learning tonight." The leader inhaled sharply, a wounded sound, almost, and the two men behind him stiffened as though bracing for a blow, uncertain of where it might fall. Thomas's sobs softened into a trembling silence as he looked around the room, finally noticing what had changed. He was not the only witness to the unraveling. The men who had come wearing the invisible armor of intimidation were now unarmored by doubt. Their shadows no longer seemed as tall. Their boots no longer sounded like thunder. They were just men, fallible, frightened of losing a world they had inherited rather than earned. The leader pointed at James again, but his voice lacked the thunder it once carried. "You think one night changes anything?" he hissed. James met his stare with quiet steadiness. "One night can change everything," he replied, tone barely above a whisper but resonant as a hymn in an empty church. The young man swallowed hard, and the third man, a broad, silent figure up until now, shifted back a half step, his confidence faltering. That single motion, small as it was, signaled the truth the leader feared most. He no longer commanded the room, and as the weight of that realization settled, the night itself seemed to lean in, listening to the last threads of an old power fray. In the presence of a man who refused to bow, the house felt suspended between breaths, as though the walls themselves were waiting to see which way the night would finally tilt. The leader stood rigid, his authority thinning like smoke in a rising wind. James could see the moment dawning on the man, the unsettling realization that he was no longer steering the current, he was drowning in it. The lamplight trembled over his face, revealing a flicker of something he could not conceal. Doubt. It carved its way into his features, softening the harsh lines that had once defined him like a chiseled threat. The silence stretched, long and taut, until even the dust motes seemed to hang motionless in the air. James stayed perfectly still, a pillar in the center of the room, his calm defying the storm that had entered Thomas Briggs' house with such confidence. The leader's breath grew heavier, uneven, and in that unevenness, the truth emerged. Control had slipped from his fingers, and he didn't know how to reclaim it. The younger man finally spoke again, voice low, hesitant. Maybe we got what we came for." His words were cautious, like a man stepping onto ice he wasn't sure would hold. The broad-shouldered man beside him nodded once, almost involuntarily, as if some primal instinct told him the night had turned against them. The leader whipped his head toward them, anger flaring like a struck match. But the fire in his eyes quickly dimmed when he realized neither man was meeting his glare. They were looking at James instead, waiting for something unspoken, something they had never expected to seek from him. Measure. The leader's fury faltered. "We ain't done," he snapped. But the sharpness in his voice was brittle, brittle enough to break under its own force. He looked from man to man, searching for the old unity that once formed effortlessly between them, but found only unease. The ritual they had intended to carry out had dissolved into a question none of them were prepared to answer. What happens when fear refuses to kneel? James leaned back in his chair, slow and deliberate, reclaiming the space with a quiet authority that felt older than the land. Beneath them, "If you leave tonight," he said evenly, "you leave knowing something different than when you came." His voice held no threat, no heat, just truth, plain and steady. The younger man swallowed, shoulders relaxing as if he had been waiting for permission to step away from the abyss. The broad man exhaled deeply, the breath of someone relieved to find the night offering an exit he hadn't expected. But the leader, he lingered in the struggle. Pride warred with reason behind his eyes, and for a moment it looked as though he would stubbornly force the night back onto its original rails. Yet even he recognized that the room no longer obeyed him. No ritual could be completed without the will of those who stood beside him, and that will had fractured. With a tight jaw and a face drawn taut with wounded pride, he finally stepped back. "This ain't over," he muttered, but the threat lacked its former power. The men withdrew toward the hallway, shadows shrinking. Behind them, as they disappeared into the dim corridor, the air in the house loosened for the first time since James arrived. The storm had not broken him. If anything, it had revealed the strength in his stillness. And as Thomas slid to the floor, sobbing into his hands, James remained upright, anchored, breathing the heavy but victorious truth. The night had come to judge him, but it was the night that walked away changed. When the house finally emptied of footsteps and whispered threats, James remained seated at the worn wooden table, his hands resting calmly atop the grain, as though anchoring himself to the world that had tried to unmake him. The lamplight flickered softly, no longer trembling beneath the weight of hidden intentions, but settling into a quiet, steady glow. Outside, the night stretched wide and silent, no longer a conspirator in danger, but a witness to a transformation neither the men who had arrived nor the man they sought to judge fully understood. The storm they brought had passed without consuming him, leaving behind an unexpected stillness, one not born of fear but of clarity. James breathed it in, slow and deep, the way a man inhales the promise of dawn before the first light breaks. Thomas Brigg remained crumpled by the wall, his breath raw with guilt, his face streaked with the cost of choices he had not been strong enough to refuse. James looked at him, not with anger, nor with pity, but with the weary understanding of someone who had witnessed another man meet the truth of himself and tremble beneath its weight. "This night ain't mine alone," James said quietly, rising from the chair. "You'll carry it too," and Thomas knew it. He nodded shakily, unable to lift his eyes, knowing that even if the men returned to their daily lives and familiar cruelties, he would never again stand on the soil of his own land without feeling the echo of tonight's unraveling beneath his feet. The house had held a ritual meant to destroy one man's dignity, yet it was the ones who brought that ritual who left diminished. When James stepped out onto the porch, the night air washed over him, cool, clean, unburdened. No horses, no shadows, no pursuing threat. Only the long dirt road stretching toward home, illuminated faintly by a sliver of moonlight breaking through the clouds. He walked it with unbroken steps, not faster than usual, not slower, just steady. The same steadiness that had carried him through the confrontation, the same quiet strength that the men had not known how to confront. Behind him, the house stood dim and shaken, its walls forever marked by the night they tried and failed to turn into a warning. Ahead of him, the road opened into a vast, uncertain world. But James understood the truth now, the truth they had inadvertently revealed. Sometimes a man survives a night not to escape it, but to change the shape of the ones that follow. And as he disappeared into the softness of the Delta dawn, that truth traveled with him.